Right, well, let's get started. I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Matherly to the podcast today. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Johnny. Great to finally talk to you.
Brilliant stuff. So, really appreciate you taking the time to join me. Super excited about all the statement of work, services procurement stuff we've got to talk about today, because you and I really love this topic. We both earn our ability to talk about it by doing the hard yards, and I think there's going to be some great points we're going to cover today. But I would introduce you as a statement of work expert because you've got some amazing experience in this area. But firstly, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've loved our conversations over the years, and this has always been a dream of mine to do this. And when I saw John Holden was on your podcast, I said, I can't let him outdo me. So I got to get on there somehow.
Good stuff. Excellent. So before we dive into the topic areas we're going to cover, which is really around where SOW fits into that kind of extended workforce technology stack. Would you just be able to give a bit of a background summary on your wealth of experience and particularly targeting this area?
Sure, absolutely. So I started off at Capital One in their IT department, managing their finance group. And this was back when they were in hyper growth mode. And I'm going to date myself by telling you that that was in the 90s. But as the finance manager in a large IT organization, I was handling all of the consulting invoices and budget. And it didn't take me long to realize that they were in awful shape. And there was no rhyme or reason to why, we were being charged some rates, and it was an awful lot of money. And so I opened up a conversation with our supply chain team, which is what they used to call them back then, and really started giving them feedback. And after a while, the head of supply chain basically told me to either shut the bleep up and let us do our best, or come over here and see if you can do any better. So that's how I got into procurement. So I did. I took the opportunity to join the procurement team, and really focused on the consulting services spend. It wasn't a defined category at the time, obviously. So for 3 years, beat my head up against the wall, working with existing systems, working with the lack of visibility and the lack of control, and started to figure things out, and brought consulting spend as well as the rest of professional services under management, which was about $1 billion annually at the time. And during my tenure there, we absolutely did the segmentation. We instituted strategic sourcing. We developed all sorts of vendor performance, category strategies, and so forth, but also participated in building one of the industry's first SOW workflow engines in the PeopleSoft platform. And it wasn't quite good enough to put on the manager's desktop to be self-service. So it was just me and my team that were using it to manage. But we had, Johnny, we had close to 500, 600 SOWs per year that led into that roughly $1 billion. And just the transactional, logistical, operational aspects of it were crushing. And we needed a technology platform to, and it's no joke. I mean, I've been on that side that I sell now to customers and prospects. You really need that control and visibility. So it took us a while, but we got it. And then we really started to make some serious inroads into spending money wisely. And, savings was important, but it wasn't the most important thing for a hyper growth credit card company that couldn't spend money and make money fast enough. So we were really focused on just, ending the chaos and getting control of the process, and kind of doing the right thing with regards to managing our suppliers and our spend. In addition to that, I also spun off a handful of contingent labor categories, which was part of the strategy, shifting, away from professional services where we were on SOW, where we were paying consulting firms very high rates uncontrolled. We established several categories as offshoots to that, as staff augmentation. And that was part of the results that we achieved. And it really made sense. Once you had the visibility and you saw that you were paying PwC and KPMG and other large audits and consultancies to do internal audit work, it only made sense for us to create an internal audit category and negotiate staff aug-like rates, as opposed to the rates that those big boys charge when their audit advice is on the line. So it's just one example of how we leverage the control and visibility into the spend. After that, the last initiative I had at Capital One was to support our CFO and our CPO in a organizational change, which included a procurement transformation. So we brought in McKinsey to do the organizational change, but we chose A.T. Kearney to do the procurement transformation. And lo and behold, one of the targets that A.T. Kearney took in their assessment was my role, because I was the originating category guy. So I wore the contracts hat, the sourcing hat, the vendor performance hat, the category strategist hat. And rightfully so, they recognized that wasn't a sustainable practice. And they made me the offer to wear one hat or take a package. So I took a package and started my own business called Sourcing for Services. That was effectively taking what we were able to do at Capital One with an internally managed MSP and create a private label offering that several MSPs in the US partnered with us ultimately to support their accounts on the SOW side. So that's kind of how I got into it. We were supporting the Oracle account with GRI, our partners there, managing all of their IT SOWs. And we recognized that a lot of them coming in were at risk for independent contractor status. So that's where I made the connection that, hey, we've been managing IC SOWs along with corp to corp SOWs all along, but we hadn't been screening them. So we incorporated that into the solution. Oracle stakeholders were gracious enough to grant us the opportunity to bid to be their AOR. So they followed our recommendation that they needed to do that, but we didn't win because we were pretty much an SOW focused shop and we didn't have the IC compliance expertise that was necessary. But that did springboard myself and my business partner to develop that capability. So an offshoot of Sourcing for Services was IC PreCheck, where we did set ourselves up as a agent of record that really did focus on US-based screenings. And everything since then, we sold our company in 2020 and dissolved the partnership. And I worked for an MSP and FMS, and now I work at eTeam, building their SOW capabilities, which very intentionally is spanning across IC SOW and corp to corp. So very much doing their global AOR business and their global SOW business. So I think that's enough of an introduction, but certainly happy to field any questions about that you might have.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great stuff in there. I remember, I think we first met when you were doing some work consulting into Spend Matters,
Yes.
looking at technology across the market. And that's
Yes.
one of the things that I find really intriguing about this conversation, because your subject matter expertise is so deep in this area of services procurement, but it's also across that kind of FMS, direct sourcing, vendor management systems, gig economy marketplaces, all that sort of stuff. You've had so much exposure to the various platforms that have kind of come and gone and are growing now, that you've got a good context to see the wider view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that period of my career, and I'm very thankful to Jason Bush and Andrew Carpy for allowing me to participate with them in doing that, because it gave me a great exposure to the different technologies that were out there. What can happen sometimes is when you get into service delivery, you get focused on the one platform that you're using, and that becomes everything because that's the decision that was made. And the reality was there was a plethora of other providers out there that I wanted more information on. So, was very thankful that Andrew and Jason sort of allowed me to participate with them and take the lead on the SOW side of it. And you're right, Johnny, that's where I was exposed to the FMS, which is, your predecessor company and system, exploring all the different FMSs out there and the VMSs. I helped with the full extended workforce capabilities, but obviously I took the lead on the SOW side and really got a view of where the different platforms were coming from. And as you and I have talked before, FMSs, freelance management systems, originated with one goal in mind, whereas the VMSs kind of originated with a different goal in mind. But we find them even today converging on the same spot. They're just coming at it from different directions. And I think that's one of the things to be on the lookout for, is how will that investment in those two different approaches kind of coalesce into supporting, the new contingent labor workforce. And because they haven't really been cohesively doing that to date. The VMSs started off as staffing temp labor workflow support, which they've done a great job. FMSs started off doing freelancers, really focused on building talent communities, both public and private, focused on building the profiles. But really the engines on the back end of them, when you were talking about SOW, the workflows were very similar. It's just the upfront activities are very different for a corp to corp, where you have to do due diligence, you have to check their DUNS number, you have to do the insurance check, you have to do a lot of things to align with your client company's regulatory environment and other requirements for their position in the market, which is different than when you're hiring freelancers, where the real focus on the due diligence phase, the upfront onboarding phase, is proper worker classification. But once you get past that stage, you really are in the SOW space. You're putting a statement of work in place with both of them. So the functionality that we need in the platform, the value that the platform can add to those two different channels, really converges and should be the same. And I don't think it's too far of a stretch to suggest that the upfront, the onboarding, the initiation of those requests can also have a common entry point, if you will, and be handled almost on the same in the same workflow. It's just you're diverging to different checklists within your platform to onboard them properly according to their type of vendorship that they being engaged as.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think when you break into services procurement and you kind of segment it, that kind of aspect of it where it leans more towards the kind of freelancer side, again, is quite different to the real heavy duty IT services, big consulting firms, real kind of heavy duty services procurement. I think, but have you worked within the VMS landscape as well? You've got experience on that side as well.
Yeah, no. When Capital One gave me that great opportunity to go out and start my own business, I was the supplier diversity champion at Capital One. And as such, I had been going to the NMSDC, the National Minority Supplier Development Council conferences on a regular basis. So, I had hung my shingle out as an independent consultant sourcing for services, and decided to go to the very next conference, which was in New Orleans of the NMSDC. And lo and behold, on the floor of that conference, I met a guy named Doug Levy. And Doug Levy was at that time the head of sales for Beeline. And he and I somehow started talking about SOW and what I'd done at Capital One and how I had both managed our internal MSP, but also had developed the technology. And Doug, being a part of Beeline, which they hadn't spun off Pontoon yet, so they had both the MSP and the VMS there. So he engaged me, my first consulting engagement. Shout out to Doug. Every time I see him, I thank him profusely for giving me a start and giving me the confidence to continue being an independent provider. But we worked on developing that strategy for Beeline, both on the MSP side and the VMS side. And that was wonderful. We had a great experience, and it was a nice long engagement. But it did lead me into the space of saying, look, Beeline's not the only one out there that could probably use some support or help with their SOW capabilities. So after that, I actually went to work for IQN before Beeline, or before they bought Beeline, and was their SOW practice lead. And interestingly enough, John Martin, the late great John Martin, who was the chief operating and chief technology officer at IQN at the time, hired me. In between him making the offer and me actually starting is when they made the decision to bifurcate their business, VMS and MSP. So I thought I was coming into another situation where I was going to be supporting, MSP and technology, but overnight, IQN became a technology platform only. So I found myself, thankfully, it was a great experience working with the team there, selling, strategizing, designing solutions, developing strategies, and really cool to me was working with the MSP partners. And was part of the group that sort of had to convince all these MSPs who IQN used to compete with. Now we had to convince them that, no, we're just technology. We want to partner with you as a VMS. So that was a bit of a challenging conversations, but, a couple of drinks, several dinners, consistent, confidence building, trust building, and it worked out. So I really had the opportunity to work with some great people, Legis, that team over there, Kelly, Tapfin, lots of the MSPs that ended up working with IQN. I would kind of be the SOW technology guy that would join in the presentations or help with the discoveries and so forth. So it was a great exposure for me to learn that side of the business, but also be focused on the technology. And truth be told, I really love the technology aspect more than the service side. But the reality of our business is you need to have both of them in one capacity or another in order for a SOW based solution to be successful. But yeah, and then I also worked with Shashank and Narayan at Vindley. They were very kind to engage me as well, and I spent a couple of days in their first Cincinnati offices talking about SOW. And they were, super cool in how they were approaching building the VMS. They were very engaging. They really knew their stuff and really wanted to build an SOW capability that would compete, right? Because they were the newcomers. They had to build something that would compete with the IQNs, Beelines, and Fieldglasses. And obviously they ultimately did, not because of me, but because they were really smart guys and they got their hands on a bunch of money that enabled them to really just build a great product. So that's and I'm supporting one that I can't name right now, helping them develop. It's a mid-tier VMS, develop their SOW capabilities. So yeah, technology is a big part of my life and my geekiness over SOW.
I find it fascinating, and I think one of the areas that would be great to drill into, which is inevitably we will do as we go through this discussion. I'm kind of just making some notes here as we talk, and one of the things I've noted down here is, might sound overly dramatic, but the fight for SOW, because if you look within MSP providers, there's been that battle. Is this a priority? Do we want to invest in it? Is it taking attention away from other things? Is it confusing our sales scenario? Are we, kind of eating someone else within the organization's breakfast? And the same within the VMS, in the sense that if you want to create a best-in-class solution for managing people and time, that's different from creating a best-in-class solution for managing, real outsourced work provision.
Yeah.
So I think that's a kind of a bit of a theme that would be great to tap into as you go along, because I see it all the time. Um,
I do
but
too as well. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just to go back to yeah, I mean, you were really heavily involved in SOW in the staffing industry before it was cool. I don't know if it's cool now. I think it is, but really in the early days of it. And the fact that you came from a true services procurement background is quite rare. That was kind of ahead of its time. You got a lot of the kind of larger MSPs now trying to bring in that sort of talent, trying to have that kind of capability. But that must have been there must have been some scenario. It must have been great, but there must have been some scenarios where what you were saying fell on deaf ears, where maybe some staffing organizations, it was so early in the game, it was difficult for them to get their head around it because their core business was such a big area of growth.
Yeah, no, look, and I can remember having conversations with some really great staffing firms who also had development shops and could do project work. And, they wanted to get on the list, right? And they had the mentality of our program and other programs that I was aware of how do we get on the SOW, the project list? And the reality was staffing and project work are different from soup to nuts, from beginning to end. And so I can remember working with our suppliers because we wanted them to be successful on this SOW side if they had capabilities that we could leverage, because then we could negotiate more favorable terms when they were supporting two channels. So we really worked on, how they branded themselves, and subsequently part of my independent contractor work was consulting with staffing firms on how to position themselves with procurement stakeholders. And really, the key messaging was you needed to brand yourself slightly differently. You can't go into talk to procurement about doing projects and services for $500,000 to $1 million and rely on your individual placements, at $50, $7,500 an hour. The hiring managers were different. The process was different. The underlying objectives were inherently different, right? When you come in and you have a particular skill set on your resume, you're delivering that skill set in a staff aug setting. That's great. It's important. But when you talk about SOW, that's a unique scope of objective and scope of requirements that the company is looking for. They're looking for results. They're looking for deliverables. So it didn't land well when staffing firms would go in and talk to procurement stakeholders about their project work without really tweaking their message to be more procurement focused, more project delivery focused. And they tended to lean too much on their staffing success, which, don't get me wrong, staffing success is wonderful, but it really doesn't mean a whole lot on the procurement side when you're talking about projects and services. If you have the relationship, that will buy you a meeting with procurement, most likely. But if you don't go to that table with procurement, start talking the lingo and using the right terminology and really staying focused on deliverables and, working with the internal team to get the right scope of work designed or developed and managed to, and you can incorporate project management into the delivery of your projects or services, then you really weren't going to make much headway. And I think there's, some staffing firms that have made the transition. Obviously, they can do both staffing and project work, but it wasn't an easy win for them. If you look back on history, it took a while for them to figure things out. And just one last point on this. The company organization also needed to adjust its thinking. I can remember thinking, "Oh, we would never talk to a staffing firm. We're SOW. We're special. We do projects and services." So we had to adjust our thinking to say, "Look, we should not hold that against them. We should actually look for the positive in the relationships that we've had with them, and then test them, right? And just give them a chance." And some of them fell flat, but some of them actually turned out to be very good project delivery firms. And and we started to treat them as such. It also led to revised or additional MSAs, because you can't deliver a project under a staffing MSA or under a standard PO. You kind of have to have a different approach to it. So there was a logistical things, but it was a great evolution that I think is still going on today. I think some staffing firms are still wondering, can I get into it? How do I get into it? Is it worth getting into, and so forth.
It's all about the risk, isn't it? It's a different type of business.
Different type of business.
The inherent delivery contractual risks, whether they can find the people to do the work and deliver it, and save the organization money against using a big contractor, a big outsourced firm provider.
Yeah.
Depends. That might be the case, but have they got the capabilities to manage it effectively? Have they got the appetite for risk? Can they separate the entity out effectively? I think in the UK, some of it was tied to the kind of like issues around misclassification, 1099 versus W2 in the US, IR35 in the UK. When those laws changed, a lot of staffing firms tried to jump on the bandwagon of delivering project services, as I tend to call it. But really, it is very different to delivering a staffing solution. Yeah. Some organizations, and we work with some organizations that are very effective at it. Some of them have typically been doing it for quite a while, and then just got to the point where they needed to automate and get some technology in place to manage that kind of back-to-back SOW process. But really, if you compare SOW management with a contingent workforce MSP solution, that's much more, although they're very, very different work delivery channels, there's a similar problem-solving set that you're dealing with. And it's more about managing the suppliers, managing bids, making sure the process happens effectively, applying some input to make sure pricing and scoping is done effectively, and then helping the organization manage the logistics of the process, bringing in technology, helping them adopt technology as the enabler for that. Whereas delivering project services is so different that it's a big leap for a lot of these organizations, unless they acquire somebody like you've got a Codis and people like that out there, where it's kind of built in, and acquisitions and mergers and stuff like that that make it very effective.
Yeah, no, and it's one of those realizations that both buy side and sell side have really had struggled to recognize and incorporate that recognition of the differences between managing those two different types of programs or two different types of engagements. The MSPs, as we were talking earlier, they still struggle with understanding what it takes to deliver great SOW management services. A lot of MSPs tried to do that with their existing temp labor MSP staff, and it fell flat. And it's been part of the reason why this credibility gap has developed within the MSP group, because they haven't, not all of them, I'm not painting with a broad brush here, but you can tell when an MSP provider has really invested in building out a team that understands SOW, services procurement, not only how to manage it, but how to transactionally support it. And in a MSP that has not yet made that investment or that shift. There's very limited capabilities of what they can do with their existing staff. And I'm not saying that's not a value add. I'm just saying it's a very limited value, and is not something that a company, a client, organization could grow with, right? When you go in and find an external provider of SOW MSP services, whether it be an MSP, a standalone business, or even internally, you have to recognize that what the company needs in support of that. That's why in my current role at eTeam, we've really focused on compliance and operations, because most organizations that are pretty far down on the maturity curve are really looking for Gen 1, maybe Gen 2 SOW support solutions. And the focus really continues to be, control and visibility over the transactional activity and the spend. And bringing that SOW tail spend under control. We're seeing, a lot of technology, AI influenced technology starting to address that for the larger pools or buckets of spend in the tail spend. But even outside those, there's a lot that you can do with a VMS technology like yours, even just a service layer that can bring, if not all of it, at least the majority of it, under more active management. I mean, I hesitate oftentimes when I'm talking about first or second generation solutions to use the term best practice, because really that's up here. What you need is just a slightly better practice to get started, right? So getting that control and visibility is like table stakes. And then what you do with that really starts to put you on a maturity path that will tell where you're heading. I'm that you see in talking to prospects and customers, understanding what maturity your stakeholders are, either the procurement organization or the program that's looking at your technology to do SOW. Understanding where they are on the maturity path in their organization is really important to what kind of solution that they'd really be open to. Whether the solution that you have is too much over their head and they need to get some help. I mean, oftentimes we, as a consultant, I've gone in and found organizations that knew they wanted to do something and had to do something, but the ability to support the technology that I could have brought in wasn't. It would be wasted money on that software because internally they didn't really know what to do. Now I could work with them to build their internal capabilities, build out the team and so forth. But generally what I would recommend was, hey, get an MSP or a service provider in here that can help you implement, because that's the key. And then build and maintain your SOW program for at least a period of time, and then consider insourcing it if that's what you really want to do. It's much easier to transition from an externally managed MSP to an internally managed MSP on the SOW side than it is the reverse. So like when I was at my prior employer, we had an internally managed program which ran really well. Every 2 years, I would do the business case to determine, hey, should we bring in an outside MSP to take this over for us so that we can go do other stuff in procurement? And we never could make the business case work, not because of the economics per se, but because of the culture and because of the relationships we had with internal stakeholders and the perceived and the declarations of internal stakeholders who said, don't you dare bring in an outsource provider or have an MSP take over this relationship. So we really were fearful that we would lose the support of our internal customers if we brought in an external provider who just didn't have the internal knowledge that we had. So eventually that employer made the transition, but it was a bit of a rocky one.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that SOW is going to follow a similar evolution to the kind of original contingent workforce evolution. You got that interesting bifurcation. I remember having a really cool chat with Jay Shekawat about this, the founder of Fieldglass. Exactly the same topic, just talking about diverging from, do you want to be an MSP and technology? Do you just focus on technology? And obviously Beeline and Fieldglass, or IQN and Fieldglass, had slightly different strategies, but have kind of ended up doing the same, taking the same route. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be easier for people to get a helping hand to start with, bring in some expertise, have someone bring in the technology, get things running, and then over a period of time they can manage that on their own when they've really kind of gone through the process and got, let's say, a mature program up and running. But we've got some clients that take the technology directly. They're super organized internally. They know exactly the spend they want to address. They've got the team, they've got the resources to do it. They're kind of in the situation you were discussing at Capital One. But in other scenarios, it just wouldn't make sense. There's clients that we work with via MSPs that we probably couldn't sell to directly right now because they need that MSP intermediary as part of it. People, a service, and a technology-enabled service is what they need. Whereas some organizations just need the technology because they've got the capabilities.
Look, John, I think that's why, platforms like yours that can be standalone and you can integrate with a VMS, but you certainly don't need a VMS to exist and to support either an external service provider, which I know you have MSP partners that you work with, and hopefully someday that we'll work together as I build this program and capability out. But internally managed services procurement, it's a very different beast. So the ability to take on a dedicated SOW platform that helps them do their business internally is, I think, exactly what the market needs. I used to be of the opinion, maybe you were as well, a few years back, that it made sense. It made most sense to have all the channels of contingent labor being supported by a single technology and a single service provider. This was years ago, before I had my eyes opened to a different way of thinking about it. Thinking that, all that needs to be managed together. So if you want true channel optimization, you kind of had to have your hands on all channels, right? That meant staffing, that meant freelancers, that meant SOWs, so that you could classify them properly and optimally and put them in the right channel and see it through. Well, with the way systems are today and the highly integrated nature, APIs, and the sharing of data, I no longer believe that. I believe that you can have a standalone SOW solution. I believe you can have a standalone FMS solution for freelancers, and you can still use the VMS for your temp labor staffing firms. And with the ability to kind of gather or capture the data and bring it up for analysis, that's the key. What I think is every one of those solutions, if I were to get on my soapbox a little, should have their own decision tree tool on the front end to allow for other channels to exist and for the customer to have a common entry point that allows them to do their own self-classification, if you will, and have it routed to the right system. There's no reason that, if it's an SOW, it can't go to Zivio, or if it's an FM, if it's a freelancer, it can't go to Zivio or to WorkSuite or somewhere else. And if it's a staffing, then you go to one of the VMSs. That's an easy gap to fill. And it's not really even a gap. It's just it's a simple technology to use. You can still manage the entirety of your contingent labor workforce using multiple systems. So, no longer are you tied to a VMS or beholden to a VMS to do everything for you, and to let the VMS in of itself determine the scope of your program. What I think is interesting and missed opportunity still is the MSPs haven't really figured that out until recently. Back in the day, I was curious not only why weren't MSPs getting into SOW, but why weren't they doing EOR and AOR, right? Employer of record, agent of record, helping companies manage their freelancers. Even before COVID hit, we started to see the spike, and freelancers were the fastest growing segment of the extended workforce. But then COVID just threw fuel on that. And, you're starting to see a little bit more, but you're starting to see the evolution or the emergence of EORs and AORs, like my company, eTeam, that really are filling gaps that the MSPs have not yet really incorporated as their own. I'm not sure I quite understand it. There are different risks, different models, different investment, but nonetheless, I think in this day and age, you can manage all channels quite effectively with differing technologies and differing service providers.
Yeah, I mean, I'd definitely be joining on that soapbox for that one. We're exhibiting at the CWS Staffing Journalists Summit Europe in London at the end of May, and it's one of the things I'm really interested in talking to people about. Just the fact that it's a lot simpler than people actually realize.
Yeah.
We've got plenty of programs in place where this is all happening, and it works.
Yeah.
You need to link things up at the beginning, and you need to link things up at the data endpoint, but it absolutely works, and you're dealing with the right system for the right purpose, rather than trying to. You can't, as you said about the different parts of the technology ecosystem. They're coming from different angles. if your angle is dealing with people and, you know, engaging people on a time basis, that's totally different to outsourcing the outputs and deliverables of a project to an external service provider. They're two very, very different things. And then you've got direct sourcing, you've got freelancer management, you've got the gig side of it, and then you've got the traditional contingent workforce, contractor and temp side of it. You know, it's horses for courses. If you're gonna do it properly, you need to make sure you've got the right platforms in place for that organization, for the different channels that they utilize, and linking it together. I mean, we find people have decision trees in sometimes in their source to pay platform, maybe Workdays, ServiceNow, all different places. We've got some situations where the decision tree sits in Zivio, and there's actually, you know, the outcome of that decision will, if it's a contingent scenario, it'll push them to the VMS. It's, you know, people always say, oh, do you integrate with a VMS? And I always think to myself, what does someone mean by that? What do they want from that? Because ultimately it's almost you need to be integrating a level above that. You need to be integrating at the point that this is part of your suite. And then obviously you need to be looping things up around the data. I had a brilliant conversation with Chris Radvansky, who's the data guy in the contingent workforce magnet, got his own company, Rad Consultants. And we had a really interesting debate, which actually started at the CWS Summit in Dallas last year, when we were talking about this and just saying the data's different. You can't just homogenize it and stick it all under day rates. It doesn't work like that, because you get deliverables and the complexity of true services procurement. So I absolutely 100% agree with you. And as I say, that's something that I'm very much looking forward to talking to people about at these kind of summits, because it can be done. I think a lot of the time people are just in a situation where they just think, to coin a phrase of Paul Vincent at Randstad, that this is in the too difficult to do box, but it doesn't need to be. And it's really, that's starting to come to the fore now.
It is. And one of the things that we've noticed, and maybe you have as well, is when you have these more targeted solutions that can support, or, you know, stand alone. It used to be that the VMS technology would say, well, no, we can't do anything for you unless you've got 20, 25, $30 million of SOW spend. We can't even turn the lights on, right? You know, for the older legacy systems, that was true. It was a very heavy lift just to turn it on. But nowadays, with the targeted solutions, and I would dare to say that yours would fall in this group, you can actually add value and be profitable yourselves with a much lower spend amount running through your system. So, you know, one of the objectives of what we built in our building at eTeam is the ability to support customers who only have 5, 7, 8, $10 million of SOW spend, and the ability to support them, add value, and help them grow to be one of the 20, 25 million over time. That's an underserved market on the SOW side that I think, you know, we're really going to be going after. And, you know, we're looking at technologies to support us in going after that. You know, obviously you have to be ready, willing. As a SOW service provider, we're still that stepchild, right? When it comes to full tech contingent labor. If somebody's doing a Gen 1, they'll say, yeah, we want to do SOW, but let's make that phase 2, phase 3 in the out years. Let's focus. And I understand it. That's a different show that we could talk, you know, the full hour on. But now the ability, and this was, you know, when I do consulting, and it's no secret now, I think everybody's kind of suggesting this, is don't make it so damn difficult to implement SOW. Put a switch on your system so that you can throw the switch, SOWs on, with a very standard default that is aligned with better or best practices, so that the client can jump into SOWs and manage just a small handful to see what it's like, or as kind of a stepping stone into a more full-blown SOW support service or scoped program. And we're starting to see that more. That is what excites me, is now the threshold for the demand holders, for the buy side, the bar has been lowered. Hey, you mean I used to ignore my $5 million of SOW spend because I didn't have a technology to support me. Now there are plenty of technologies that will support them and they can get real value out of, and it becomes a growth platform for them. And, we often talk in our business about how contingent labor and certainly services procurement, SOW spend, is a differentiator, a competitive advantage that, client companies have over their competitors. Well, that happens at the mid-tier as well. So the ability to become a SOW client of preference is real for the suppliers. If you go in and you've got to deal with kind of a chaotic environment, and the onboarding is painful, and the start is delayed for 30, 60 days after the contract is signed, if the contract ever gets signed, that's a real pain in the ass for the vendors to deal with. So the ability to sort of create a smooth engagement and onboarding process not only benefits from control and visibility for the client side, but let's not forget those vendors out there, they have choices to make. Yes, they want business, but they want the business that's easier to be onboarded, has automated workflows, automated e-signatures on their SOWs, a little bit more sophisticated and savvy with regards to engaging them. That's highly critical criteria for vendors to consider.
Such an important point. I think, the vast majority of companies in all sectors globally have a problem with managing services spend. It's a simple fact. They don't manage it effectively. They have all kinds of problems. What you were talking about with Capital One, where they were kind of in this, very, very basic situation. I see that all the time now. Even now, and you're talking back in the 90s, I see that all the time now with large organizations that you think would be highly sophisticated. But the barriers around legacy technology, whether that be legacy VMS or whether that be source to pay, procure to pay platforms, that is not going to support the capability to manage and control this type of spend, is one of the problems. But the other problem is just it's too big to move. It's too big a problem to solve. If it's got to be 30 million, 50 million, 100 million spend to make it worthwhile, and it's going to take 6 months to 2 years to roll it out, and it's potentially going to be a dog's breakfast by the end of it, that puts a lot of organizations off. And it might be that in a spend category of, say, I don't know, 3 to 10 million annual spend, that doesn't mean that's all of their spend. They could have 1 billion of spend that they're dealing with, but they might just be willing to dip their toe in, and they might want to manage that particular area of spend. We've got some organizations that will come to us and say, we just want to manage the consultancy category, or we just want to manage this tail spend that sits adjacent to contingent workforce, where it's those kind of gray area SOWs. And other organizations might say it's all of the relevant categories, or just IT services or something like that. So I think just having the flexibility to be able to implement solutions at all levels and implement them in an agile manner, quickly, make them easy to use, make them dedicated to their purpose. I mean, we've got clients who are seeing savings in like sub 6 months. They're seeing return on investment, and that's including MSP costs within those programs. So there's so much to go after, but the level of maturity is so low. And I was going to ask you, actually, I find that when you were talking about Capital One, I find it fascinating. Like I say, lots of companies now are still in that situation. And it is, and it's something that one of our customers, Telent, the key procurement stakeholder at Telent, said to me, great point, which was, it's very hard to put the business case for change forward in an organization that's doing really well. An organization is super profitable, or they're a financial services organization, they're not really worried about cash. It's not the biggest problem. Right. It's hard to get that moving. What were the key drivers within Capital One that actually got this, made this a priority, other than, and this is something I always say, you need a change agent. You were the change agent that was saying, this isn't good enough, we should be doing this better, there's problems. So that is a critical factor that I often see in these programs. But other than that, what was the key driver that you were able to, or they were able to latch onto?
Now, are you talking about for us leveraging the VMS technology or outsourcing to the MSP eventually?
Just basically saying this needs to be brought under control. So within Capital One, when you're looking at this, because often if you say statement of work, some people hate that, but ultimately it is the key central point that unites all of this stuff, because people can get confused in talking about different categories or indirect versus direct, and that depends what industry you're in. And ultimately, for us as a technology provider, and for you with the type of services you're delivering, if it's contracted under a statement of work, an outcome-based or output-based deliverables, that is relevant. If it's not, it's not. So the statement of work is critical, but then when you get into the world of services procurement, organizations, you mentioned A.T. Kearney earlier. I had a great conversation with Dr. Eloise Epstein from Kearney, and I was talking about services procurement, and she just stopped me and said, Johnny, you're being a bit of a geek here. You know, in procurement circles, what does that mean in procurement teams? You know, they're looking at a category strategy.
Indirect versus direct.
Yeah, exactly. And so in terms of like who owns services procurement, you know, it can sit across multiple categories. It's a complex thing. So when you were within Capital One, what was it that actually pushed it over the edge of someone saying, let's do something about this?
Great question. I can tell you who doesn't own services procurement or SOW spend. It's not HR. It's not talent acquisition. And sometimes it's not even finance.
No.
Although finance has a better chance of influencing it. So to answer your question more specifically, what worked for me in a Capital One was simply having an owner for it. I mean, literally being the IT finance manager and having the majority of that $1 billion of spend with professional services or consulting firms going through IT, going through my hands and my chief of staff's hands for the invoices and the payments. We as a key stakeholder within the organization, or I'm sorry, key consumers of consulting spend in the organization, we recognized something was wrong. And we didn't like that, right? We felt like it wasn't being managed very well. You know, there were functional differences where, hey, that's the supply chain procurement organization, that's their job. Well, at some point you just have to recognize, okay, it may be their job, but it's not getting done. And I'm only speaking to this from a level of maturity of the organization. Nobody's going to come back and say that Capital was ill managed because of this. They actually were very focused on CMM maturity advances, and that actually helped me manage to spend a little bit more. That's maybe a separate conversation about how the organizational maturity influenced what we did on the service procurement side. But when our head of supply chain said, come over and do it or leave us alone, and I took him up on that, and my IT leadership supported me in that, that was the key step, just appointing somebody to look at it. And even though we didn't have systems and we didn't have the ability to control or have visibility across all of it, at least these two eyes started looking at it and started to see some anomalies, started to see things that just didn't make sense. Like why are we paying in IT this rate for a business analyst, but over in the operational side or the card side, they're paying a totally different rate from the same consultancy? Why did we have 7, 8 different firms doing business process mapping? Right, we were in hyper growth, so everybody's trying to figure out what's our internal processes, how do we improve? Well, one of the low-hanging fruit that I found was we had like 7 or 8 different providers of business process mapping, and they were using different technology. One of them was using Visio. This tells you the age of the story. And others were doing it on PowerPoint or something else. So there was no consistency. And then finally we found that one of the scopes of work actually had one of the deliverables was to aggregate or concentrate all the different organizations' business process mapping into a single process map, level 0, 1, 2, 3, so that they were all talking and integrated with each other. So that's
the joys of consulting.
But and you use little factual points, evidence points like that. The discrepancy in the billing from the same consultancy, same level resource, doing the same function just for a different department within Capital One. You highlight those. And when you highlight them in a way that shows that we're not spending money very wisely and we're kind of being stupid when we do this, the case for change becomes self-evident. And I think that I probably spun my wheels just jumping up and down and saying, we got to change, we got to change this, and didn't get anywhere because I wasn't engaging people. I wasn't giving people a cause for them to change their activities. But when I brought to them, hey, in Capital One, there was a card department. Hey, card department, did you know that you're paying, about 30% more for the same Deloitte resource than your friends over in IT are? Do you ever wonder why that is? Well, that immediately got them on board saying, well, okay, yeah, let's try to negotiate deals, MSAs or rate cards and so forth. So bringing those things, those real life issues, opportunities for improvement to your internal stakeholders is key. And we did enough of that through our manual spreadsheets, non-system managed content or contract management system, because we had a contract management system that I was able to look at and do some searching, and it was I could find the different vendors, SOWs and so forth. Pretty much, it wasn't great, but it was enough for me to do the initial analysis. We were able to pull together enough of that self-evident data that gave individual departments the cause for change, so that when we went and tried to put our whole arms around it and say, hey, now let's do something really special, because now all of you have skin in the game. Let's build, because we just committed to PeopleSoft, and our CIO, Gregor Baylor at the time, I think, said, look, Matherly, procurement, we get it. You need a system for procurement, but it has to be a bolt-on to PeopleSoft or it's nothing, because we can't put something new into our environment right now. So fortunately, the people at PeopleSoft, we were using SPro for our temp staffing. We were at negotiation time, and we leveraged our CIO's mandate and said, look, we're not going to renew with SPro unless you agree to build this workflow at our direction for SOW. It worked. So that's how I ended up being the lead business analyst on that project. Interestingly enough, to show what a small world is and how we're still evolving as an industry, when I went back as sourcing for services supporting GRI to manage the Oracle IT SOW spend category, they were still using the functionality that I built within the PeopleSoft platform, 8-9 years prior.
Brilliant.
So I could see things that I remembered. Oh my God, it's still there. Obviously, they had advanced it and they'd done a good job. But it's funny how those things come back around to you. So my big answer to your question is it's highly important. But if you're in a immature organization, I guarantee there is data that you just have to figure out how to get your hands on it that will make your internal stakeholders' decision to go along with you putting a technology, maybe even an internal or external program team in place. It'll make it self-evident, and it'll be an easy decision for them if you show them how they're being impacted negatively by the lack of a system, by the lack of control, by the lack of spend management practices. It takes a while. If you're in a growth organization where in a culture where the managers are empowered to do what they need to do. I had some people say to me, no, I don't care. Look, I may be wasting 10% in how I'm doing this, but my ROI on these projects is 200%. So don't bother me with that small amount. That doesn't influence me. I'm not moved. So that becomes a bit of a challenge in some organizations. And that's when you sort of need to sort of recognize, okay, well, that may not be that individual department manager who's managing that particular platform or application. So you kind of go to somebody who will care. So we got our controller on board, we got our CFO on board. And even to the extent, an interesting story, in sort of, it was kind of like the milestone where I realized, and me and my team and my leadership realized, oh, okay, now we're hitting on all cylinders. We managed, obviously, within the professional services group, the Big Four, and I won't mention which supplier this was. very good supplier, but nonetheless, they had that relationship with the controller, with the CIO, with the CFO. And what I recognized was they weren't abiding by the procedures and the operational activities, and weren't responding to my request to put a rate card in place, and weren't responding to my request to do this, that, and the other. So anyway, they were basically ignoring us because they could go to their executives in the C-suite and still get the job, and still get the projects, and still get their $50, $100 million contracts renewed. We gathered enough data and came up with a strategy that basically said, look, we're going to, me and my chief procurement officer at the time, a guy named Arnold Soa, we put out a final request to the Big Four and other consultants, not just the Big Four, and said, you must put in place a rate card in order for us to renew your MSAs and for you to continue to get new business here. And we put it out. We did a follow-up with a warning. And before then, we had sort of set the table, and we had gone to this controller, to the CFO, to the CIO, to the other executives we knew they had relationships with. And we said, hey guys, here's what we're doing. You're going to get a phone call. You're gonna have a topic on your agenda with the senior partners that you're meeting with from here. Here's what they're going to ask you. They're going to say procurement's being a nuisance. They're trying to get us to do this and that, and it's distracting us from providing you projects. What we want you to do and want you to commit to do is that you redirect them to Michael Matherly. And lo and behold, our controller got the call from this unnamed Big Four provider, and they redirected them to me. And it happened with two of the Big Four. One of them finally acquiesced and agreed to sort of follow the program rules just to give us visibility and some control, and filled out a rate card. The other one didn't, and they got effectively not blackballed, but that was what we said. That our threat was, if you don't join the program, you're not going to get any new business. So one of them acquiesced. We got the rates way down. The other one basically ended up taking like a 6-7 month hiatus because they weren't getting any new business. And finally, they came back to me saying, okay, we're ready to re-engage, and we'll abide by the program rules. We'll put a rate card in place. It's a big deal because we had developed a consulting rate card, not just through the Big Four, but through the IT consultancies that even included the offshore providers, Accenture, other HR consultancies that we're working with. And when you're talking about what we had then whittled down to that category to being just over 400 million, and to have roughly, what we did was we built an implied rate card based on the SOWs for the last year. We're like this. The rate card we negotiated was 16.5% below that. So you take 16.5% across 400 million that category was spending with us. That made my career. That really made a difference. And they started the record, and they delivered just as much. They competed for work now, and everybody had visibility to it, and everybody was recognizing some savings. It wasn't just procurement savings, right? Because procurement doesn't say procurement because we're not the ones hiring them really. It's IT, it's card, it's operations, it's the other areas within the company that we're actually spending, another way to look at it, 16.5% more than they needed to get the projects done. Long answer, but there is a method to the madness in how you garner influence and how you drive change in an organization through the service procurement function. And it all has to do with data. And yes, having systems that make data readily available is super convenient and nice. But even in the days of no systems or limited systems, you still can get your hands on data and make the case.
That was a fantastic example, Michael. Really, really brilliant. More and more people are starting to do this. And that what you've just outlined there is the case for change.
Yes.
And what I was talking about earlier with regards to the drivers, like traditionally you might think some organizations it's going to come from a primary risk or misclassification driver. We've got all these SOWs going on. People are getting around headcount freezes, da 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 da. You know, there's stuff in there that's looking like contingent workforce and it's badged as SOW. That's one angle that people traditionally think about. The second angle is spend management. You know, we're spending too much. We could be making savings when we're not. And the last one is efficiency. When you talked about managing 600 SOWs in a year, you know, procurement teams are often very lean, typically they can't manage this stuff manually, and therefore no one knows anything below the level of a PO. There's no control over anything. But those three are clearly drivers. But what you need is a change agent. You need somebody who makes it their business to say, what the hell are we doing here? And they get eyes on it and they put the information in front of the right people. It's a brilliant case for change and an example there.
I wish, Johnny, I could say that I was smart enough that I went into procurement with this strategy in mind, and it was just a matter of execution. But the reality is I've got lots of dents in my head for banging my head against the wall for the first 3 years before I kind of figured that stuff out. And it was a painful lesson, but nonetheless, it was a lesson that really added value. And sometimes you just have to go through that, and you just have to be curious, right? You have to ask the questions. You have to be willing to not accept two different rates, like materially different rates being charged in two different parts of the company. I mean, if that doesn't send off red flags or flares within a procurement person's mind when they see that, then they shouldn't be in procurement, in my opinion. You have to be curious. You have to be willing to ask the tough questions. You have to roll up your sleeves and go find out, why is this? And when it leans back to a vendor or a relationship or a contract or whatever the root cause is, that's your opportunity for solving problems and adding real value.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you know, it comes down to that thing of who owns this problem, who's going to take ownership of this problem. You and I know we could walk into most organizations, if we were given the view or given the resources, it's not that difficult to put forward a case for change around this sort of stuff because it's so obvious. The potential savings are so massive. The stuff that people just aren't doing is so glaringly obvious. But when it's spread across different categories, you know, who's the stakeholder that's going to own that? Is it an individual category manager? Is it a head of procurement? Is it a chief procurement officer? They've got all sorts of other problems to look at. And often they don't understand that solutions are available. And this is where people like, for example, procurement excellence can be an excellent center point for this sort of stuff. When they're looking across their technology stack and they're just saying, okay, we've got this covered, that covered, et cetera, but we've got a massive gap here around everything we're buying under a statement of work. We've come across that in multiple cases, but such a fundamental thing to have a change agent within an organization who just says, this isn't good enough, something's got to change. And then you've got some clear reasons, risk or misclassification, spend management, and efficiency that just can take that thing through. But again, that's where being able to start small, prove the business case for change, take a small segment, the most burning, most difficult area, the urgent one, get it under control, get a system in place, get a lightweight service provision in place, prove it, and then expand it. And you know, we're rolling out pilots and proof of concepts and stuff like that, as well as full-on programs. But I feel like if you look at the evolution of the contingent workforce model, services procurement has kind of been left till now. It's really starting to come to the fore, but that's because it was too difficult. The technology didn't really support it. The service provision maturity wasn't there. But there are other blockers, and the blockers were, as I said, legacy technology, whether it's like legacy VMS, source to pay, procure to pay type platforms that was blocking, whether it's too high a cost level or it's just awful to use or doesn't do what you need it to do. Then you had the lack of knowledge within MSPs, which was blocking it. But that ties into the third way, which was the kind of wrong stakeholders. Because you've got the MSPs are in a great position to be able to deliver services around this. If they build that function and they build that capability, it's, as I say, it's a similar problem-solving exercise to a contingent workforce MSP, even though it's very different understanding and mechanism. The fundamentals of trying to solve the problem do fit that. But where they were trying to approach it from a contingent labor point of view, they just didn't get it. And also, how are they going to talk to a senior procurement person and come across as credible if all they know is contingent workforce?
That's exactly.
So they're trying to approach it through HR and TA people, and you know, with the best will in the world, they shouldn't be focused on statement of work. They should be focused on people and contractors and temps. So I feel like those things have really kind of stunted it. But now people are understanding that more and more.
Well, and I'll just sort of add on there, Johnny, and maybe you've adopted this approach as well. When in the organizations I've been in, especially in the last few years, supporting MSPs or VMSs, I oftentimes get called into the sales process, and one of the first things that I do is kind of do some discovery to sort of test out who is the stakeholder and what's their maturity, do they understand? And the reality is, as a selling side, whether you're a VMS, an FMS, or SOW technology, or a service provider, MSP, or standalone, if you're trying to sell service procurement value or SOW value, if you're not talking to the right person who understands what you're saying, you're just wasting your time. And it's one of those qualifiers that suggests that if they're having an SOW conversation, but with the wrong person, and they're not getting it, then you have to look at that and say, okay, we need to disrupt whatever process is in place and get the right stakeholder to the table for us to talk to, and who really understands the value we can bring, and more importantly, can let us know what the real pain points that they are experiencing through the organization, so that we can solve those for them. If they're not able, my apologies. If they're not able to, what's that?
Is it for me?
It is. I don't know. I didn't answer it. It could be. But if you don't have the right stakeholders there, then it's just not going anywhere. And it's interesting. I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you guys were talking about how to implement really well. Going from SOW to implementation. And one of the things that I found works really well is to engage if you're an MSP, is to have the right kind of discovery up front, so that you can check the box when you go to sell. Okay, we know this person is serious, and we know their maturity level. So then when you roll into implementation, whether you are just going for the low-hanging fruit of you're just trying to end the chaos, create control and visibility, or whether you've got a client that is ready to continue their climb and move from their current practice to best or better or best practices. And maybe even they want to focus on segmentations. Right. So, job one is control and visibility. But the reality is, sometimes you get control and visibility on a certain segment of spend that you can't just say, okay, well, we've reached a mountaintop, because you haven't. Right. You need to get that control and visibility on, or the ability to segment spend. And then you need to continue that maturity path for that segment of spend, because the fact that 50% of the spend is still at the control and visibility level doesn't mean that you shouldn't extend your capabilities on that segment and develop the category strategy, develop the source plan, and actually start to extend the savings or the value being added for that particular segment of spend. While at the same time, your MSP or your team, your program, is focusing on the control and visibility. Now, we say control and visibility like it's just everybody knows what it means. But the question that we like to ask, or we like to remind people of, you're seeking control and visibility for a particular purpose, multiple purposes, really. But from a procurement perspective, what you want is, the holy grail, which is to segment spend. The whole idea of segmenting spend is recognizing that, hey, there's a set of vendors or a pool of spend that we can treat differently and achieve savings unique to that segment of spend. And maybe there's some risk management, some compliance, some reach across your commercial grounds, or whatever. There's some real value in treating them, managing them uniquely, differently. So, in an ideal world, you take, you go in and you do the analysis, and you import, compliance and operations to across the spend tail. And then you've got a bunch of these segments that you're able to raise up through working with your internal procurement partners, of course, and say, okay, well, here's one that we're ready to sort of take out of the tailspin and actually create a category strategy for and drive the savings. We can consolidate your vendors, because that's one of the value adds is, hey, your tailspin is $100 million across 300 vendors. The master vendor database is being crushed by vendor engagements that are 5,000, 50,000, 20,000, and they're one and done vendors. So the ability to segment and create category strategies is really important. And the actual message I'm trying to instill here is the ability to do that at the category or segment level, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all SOW solution. Oftentimes, and this is what I think kind of got the MSPs off to a slow start, and the VMSs back in the day, is it was kind of a one-size-fits-all for SOW. There wasn't the ability to actually recognize a segment of spend that needed a specific source plan, or used a different template for their SOW, or had a different rate card they wanted to be applied, or there was a different sourcing process in place, or it was okay to self-source because they were pre-negotiated for self-sourcing within certain criteria. The inability,
or milestones might be different things. Milestone could be a deliverable, it could be a block of consulting time, it could be a sprint and agile process, it could be a KPI. There's flexibility. It's a huge area of spend, and it's hugely varied. And yes. I think, in line with what you're saying, as I kind of iterated before, almost all companies have this problem, but not all of them recognize it. And of the ones that recognize it, not all of them know that it's possible to solve it, which it is. And of those that do recognize it's possible to solve it, for not all of them, it's a priority at this point in time. But within that, there's a set of organizations that are making massive savings, making great strides, and really putting themselves at a competitive advantage by addressing this. And I think I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I think it's so important to have these types of conversations, especially with fantastic real world examples like you were describing with Capital One. That was amazing, because people need to know that it's there for the taking, basically.
That's right.
And it's not as complicated as people necessarily think. It's just about somebody needs to make it their problem, and there are solutions that are available, and there are people out there who are lining up to solve these problems, and that kind of category is growing all of the time, and the sophistication of that category is growing all of the time. But it's such a big opportunity in terms of the level of savings. You're not talking about 1-2% savings. You're talking about, in some cases, 20% plus savings.
Yeah. I mean, if you've got severely under or totally unmanaged spend, just putting some very basic control, and again, that's why we focus on compliance and operations first and foremost, because it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the Gen 1, Gen 2 solution that really adds incredible value to those organizations who have not yet matured on the services procurement space. The other thing I'll kind of tie back to is, I think SOW being a channel or part of the contingent workforce program scope really had some additional hurdles to get over because of the category strategies versus the undermanaged or uncategorized spend. And the one-size-fits-all VMS or MSP type of solution doesn't support the category lifecycle, doesn't support strategic sourcing. And the reality is, unlike temp labor, when you have temp labor, you've got IT contingent labor, you've got creative productivity contingent labor, you've got internal audit contingent labor. All those subcategories of contingent labor, staff aug, are managed as a group.
Yeah.
The SOW and the service procurement has their own version of that, and it's relatively called categories and subcategories, but they involve different things in the workflow, like a different template, like a different onboarding requirement, like a different rate card that's used, like a different engagement with the internal businesses. One of the things that in a hedge fund that I can't name up in Connecticut that I worked for and set up a service procurement shop for, is the value of the owner of that business working with procurement and the vendor to develop the right SOW. Sometimes it's just process driven, and procurement can kind of take the lead and push the envelope. But the reality is, if the business has to sort of be a voice in the scope and objectives and the direction of the SOW, and you can't leave it to the vendor, right? Because the vendor is going to make it time and materials. They're not going to hold themselves accountable to milestones or deliverables, and they're going to make it easy to extend or change order or amend so that it keeps ongoing. And that's where you can tell an immature organization, because they have a lot of those types of contracts in place. But the ability to engage an internal stakeholder, an owner of the demand, the project scope, to work with you on developing the SOWs is critical, because it, one, involves them in it, and two, it becomes effectively a project management tool when you have an SOW that is very well written, very clear and succinct about the deliverables and the milestones, what the acceptance criteria is, what the penalties and rewards are, when payments can be requested and when they can't, what happens when this happens. Having that involvement of the internal demand holders is really key. And I wanted to make sure I mentioned that, because, you can't, there's no services procurement superstar out there who writes their own SOWs. You have to have the collaboration, the partnership with your internal stakeholders in order to make it work. And they can't do it by themselves, clearly, because that's why there's chaos. Services procurement person can't do it themselves because they can't have knowledge about everything, and they can't write the best SOWs for the internal demand holders.
I couldn't have said it better myself, and I think it's a brilliant kind of way to draw things together and kind of wrap up the conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat through this. I know you and I could probably continue this conversation for hours because we love it, but there's so much more to talk about. Maybe we'll have to do it. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 at some stage.
I kind of knew the hook was coming, so I wanted to make sure I got a few key points there, because I know you have a bit of a soapbox on several issues, and like the last few things I mentioned, they're really important. But it doesn't matter that there's modern technologies, because modern technologies don't solve a lot of the core problems that service procurement has with their internal stakeholders. The adoption of a solution, whatever it is all about that relationship that procurement establishes with their internal stakeholders. If they're working together and they both have skin in the game, then the solution is going to work for them. If they're not working together, then the best solution in the world, the best MSP, the best VMS, the best Zivio, it's not going to do anything.
Yeah, exactly. The technology and the service is an enabler and a facilitator. Ultimately, the organizations need to have the drive to make this change, but the rewards are there. You've seen it, I've seen it, we know it's happening. And it's just exciting to be part of this. And I think this year is going to be a really good one in terms of more and more people getting involved with these programs, more technology providers getting involved, more specialist consultancies getting involved, more MSPs getting involved, and wider staffing organizations providing these services, because there's so much to go after and so much to improve. It's great to be part of it. And as I say, I really appreciate you getting involved in this conversation, because I'm pretty sure that some of the stuff that you've described today, particularly the kind of anecdotal experience that you've learned over the years you've been involved with this, is going to help people because it's just understanding what's possible, and understanding also that everyone's facing similar types of problems. And it's not like we're sitting here going, boom, there's the answer to everything. It's complicated, but there are ways to move forward. And so I really appreciate you taking the time and to give people the benefit of your experience and some of the stuff that you've worked on.
No, Johnny, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to have a conversation. I love listening to the conversations that you have with, experienced, learned, smart people. I learned so much from listening to your talks with people. So thank you for letting me join in the conversation. And look, I want to give a shout out to you to bringing Zivio along as a standalone SOW technology platform, because I think that's where we're heading. Just like I think VMS, your prior venture, targeted technology platforms, I think, are way more acceptable these days than they were. And I think we're just now starting to recognize the investment that comes into our industry can be really well returned if we're really answering the problems and solving the problems that people are actually having with services procurement, with managing freelancers, with managing staffing. And you don't have to take all three in a one size fits all, or they all come together. They should be bifurcated. They should be managed separately. And I love that you and other technologies out there are really targeting the solutions to where the real pain points are. So thank you for what you guys are doing.
Really, really appreciate your sentiments on that. And yeah, it's about commitment, isn't it? You to really solve a problem, you've got to be obsessed with it, and you've got to focus on it, and you've got to absolutely make it your mission to solve that problem. And if you look at like ATS and HRIS systems and things like that, there were various times in the past where people were like, they should all be one. Oh no, they end up better being separate. And it's just that continual kind of suite versus best of breed argument. But if we look at the technology we use in our daily lives, the apps on our phones, what we use to work, you know, it's about using the right tool for the job. And so yeah, I love being involved in a really specific niche, because it means you can really get into the detail and you can really focus on it. And as I say, it's the time in the market now where, for us being specialists in this area, for you bringing this proposition to market with eTeam, you know, it's a really great time to be part of this, because people are starting to understand that more now and recognize it, which makes our lives a bit easier.
And more fun, right? I mean, we geek out on this stuff because we love it, and I love to see the investment. I love to see the changes going on, and I love that, you know, there's so much more to learn, right? I mean, and that's why I love listening to your conversations, because everybody you bring on, I learn something more, and sometimes I think my head's going to explode, but the reality is a lot of it's just common sense, and people sharing their experiences and their anecdotes and saying, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I get that. And it's like, we just don't have enough of that. And I think that's why a lot of our service procurement industry hasn't matured or risen to the level maybe that we have on the staffing side, because not enough people are talking about it.
Well, we'll get there. And hopefully this is just one extra little kind of, you know, one extra little drop in the ocean helping towards that. But yeah, listen, thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed that chat. And yeah, hopefully we can catch up again soon. And I definitely think there'll be more to come on this conversation. So thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you, Johnny. Have a great day.